Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. My name's Kate Mackenzie, and I'm Knowledge Transfer Manager at AHDB Dairy. And tonight, the webinar is going to be on mastitis, one of the major endemic diseases in cattle, and an area of great concern, especially with the pressures of market volatility. Our presenter this evening is Professor Martin Green. So Martin is a Professor of Cattle Health and Epidemiology in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Nottingham University. Martin and his team have been leaders in the research of mastitis for many years and were instrumental in the development of the mastitis control plan, and more recently the development of the mastitis pattern analysis tool, along with colleagues from QMMS. So listening tonight, we have a good mix of TSDG and TCG members and their vets. We've got 60 people booked on this evening, so thanks very much. It's great to see such a good turnout, and I hope you find the session valuable. So the plan for this evening is that Martin is going to run through his presentation, which will take around 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for comments and questions at the end. Everyone will be muted throughout the webinar, but if you'd like to ask a question, then please type it into the question box. You'll find this on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screens. I'll ask Martin your questions at the end of his presentation. We'll answer them as best as we can and aim to finish on or before 8 p.m. The webinar is going to be recorded, so if you need to watch it back for any details or if you miss anything, then it will be available on our YouTube channel. And the link is going to be sent out after the webinar this evening, so you'll receive that. I'm going to be working in the background to keep the webinar running as smooth as possible, but please bear with me if we encounter any technical difficulties. We'll try to deal with them as quickly as possible. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce Martin. So Martin, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I wonder if you'd be able to start us off with an introduction about yourself, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. So my name is Martin Green. I'm actually a vet by training. I've been at the University of Nottingham since 2006, and I focus mainly on research. We have a group that does a variety of different kinds of research, mainly on endemic diseases of dairy cows, but we also do some sheep research. So a lot of our research focuses on mastitis and lameness. And tonight, of course, it's mastitis that we're going to be talking about. So what I intend to do is to spend actually about 30 minutes going through the slides. We're going to be focusing on control, mastitis control. We're going to describe essentially some new research which has kind of come to fruition, and which actually at the end of this you'll be able to put straight into practice, as you'll see. So I'm going to crack on then, and let's move on to the first slide if I can. Okay, so as you all know, mastitis, of course, still a very important disease. In terms of financial costs to yourselves, so a typical case of mastitis might cost £200 to £300 maybe, severe case a bit more than that. Mastitis is a painful condition, so of course it has welfare implications. And one of the things with, oh, I'm just having trouble moving the slides on, sorry. Okay, so one of the key reasons that mastitis control is talked about even more at the moment is, of course, the issue of antibiotics. And on this slide, there are a couple of reports that have come out recently. The one on the left here, this is the O'Neill report. This is one that came out in 2016 and really highlighted that we need to take antimicrobial resistance, of course, very seriously, and that agriculture has to play its role in reducing antimicrobial use to the benefits of all of us. And then on the left here, this is a report by RUMA, the Responsible Use of Medicines in Agriculture Alliance. So this is a group of stakeholders who put together, in this case, a task force that reported and set targets for levels of antibiotic reduction in different sectors. And we're going to look particularly at the dairy sector. We think about the dairy sector this evening. And what I'd like to do is just to show you the targets that Rumour came up with on this next slide. And so the antimicrobial targets for the dairy sector was this 6-point plan. And the first point is around the use of critically important antibiotics, which I realise you will have all heard a lot about, and are now being reduced quite markedly in all of the livestock sectors. Point 6 is around the total use. This is the total measurement of antibiotics, which again we're looking to have a reduction of around about 20%. But what's kind of interesting in these sector targets is that all of these 4 middle points relate to mastitis and mastitis control. So we have intramammary tubes, we have dry cow tubes, we have the use of teat sealants, and we have the use of critically important intramammary tubes. And all of these are being targeted. You can see on the right here the percentage change which the task force is recommending and hoping that will achieve by the date here of 2020. And essentially what this means is we're looking to reduce intramammary tube, lactating cow tube use by around 10%, dry cow tube use by about 20%, and an increase of teat sealants here by around 40%. And as of course you'll all know, that would mean implementing selective dry cow therapy more and more. So mastitis control is extremely important for a whole variety of reasons. And I guess that makes us think, well, what should we be aiming for in a modern dairy herd? What might we kind of count the aims of modern mastitis control as? So maybe some realistic but fairly challenging still targets might be to look at the incidence rate of clinical mastitis of being less than 20 cases per 100 cows per year, with a bulk milk somatic cell count of around about 150 or a bit less. And I think these are targets now that we do see quite a few herds achieving. No doubt there are those of you listening who can and do achieve these targets. And I think as well as achieving that, we'd now say that we'd look to do this with minimal use of antibiotics, and particularly minimizing the use of dry cow therapy and minimizing the use of injectable antibiotics, which I'll come back to a little bit later. So in terms of mastitis control, I think what we've realized over the last sort of 5 years or so is that farms are very, very different. They're very different in many ways. They're very different in the mastitis pathogens that they get, the strains of mastitis pathogens that they get. And of course, you're all very different in terms of the types of management and the types of infrastructure, the way you look after your cows. And I think it's really clear now that the one-size-fits-all approach to mastitis really doesn't work very well. I think the 5-point plan took us so far. People have tried to extend that to maybe a 7 and a 10-point plan. But I think what's clear is to really maximize mastitis control and improve mastitis performance to a very, very high level, we have to be a bit cleverer than that. We can't just do the same things on every farm. And of course, it's logical that that really won't work when farms are so different. So we're really moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach to be much, much more farm-specific in the control of mastitis. So what does it mean to control mastitis and get mastitis to very, very low levels? Well, there's really, in some ways, it should be, and it sounds relatively simple. What we need to do, of course, is to make sure that we minimize the number of new infections that cows are getting. So if we have cows that are with low cell counts and haven't had cases of clinical mastitis, what we need to make sure is that those clean cows don't succumb to new infections. And to be able to do this, we have to be able to answer probably the fundamental and key question about mastitis control. In some ways, it's the only important question to ask in terms of mastitis control, and that is, for your particular farm, when are these new infections occurring? Because if we can understand when the new infections are occurring, that means we can do something about it. We can understand what management practices we need to implement. And the basis of what we're going to be talking about just for this short time this evening is about understanding when these new infections occur. So what we've learnt is that there are some key times we know about when new infections do occur. And one of the most important divisions across all dairy farms is to know whether the infections, whether the main part of your intramammary infections, your mastitis infections, are arising at the time when your cows are dry, or if they're actually getting in after the cows have calved during the milking period. And this, you would think, sounds quite straightforward, but in fact it turns out it isn't, because when cows get infections during the dry period, of course, you don't see mastitis during the dry period. You don't see mastitis in those cows until after they calve. And so mastitis always appears, of course, when the cows are in milk, even or despite the fact that infections may have been picked up in the dry period. And I just wanted to show you this this slide, and I'll explain it a little bit here. So this is a slide of some DNA fingerprinting. These patterns, each of these columns containing a pattern, represents one organism which was identified in some cow's milk. And the pattern here, the banding pattern here, relates to the DNA in that particular organism. And when the patterns are the same as they all are in this box, this is all from one cow, it means that in fact the strain of pathogen was the same, and in fact this was the same pathogen being repeatedly found in this cow over time. And then what I need to tell you is that the first samples in this box all were from a cow during the dry period. So this pathogen got into this cow during the dry period, it stayed during the dry period, and then it was only later on after it calved, where this M is, that in fact the cow got mastitis. So we see the mastitis after calving, even though this bacteria, this bug, in this case it's E. coli, has remained in this cow through the dry period. And we see this with different cows here. So this is another cow which was infected in the dry period and got mastitis, and another one here and another one here, and these were all separate cows that this happened to. So this pattern of being infected in the dry period and then having clinical mastitis after calving has now been well established for many years. But of course, it's fundamentally important that we understand, is this going on in your farm or not? Because if these patterns are what are happening to your cows, then it means, of course, we have to look in the dry period to as the time to prevent infection. And just separating whether we need to look in the dry period or in the milking period can make a huge difference. It means you can focus attention on management of one particular period. It allows some much resource to be directed to the time of greatest importance. So a key split when we think about when do infections occur is, are they during the dry period or are they during milking? Okay, the next issue in terms of when infections are occurring on your farm really relate to the transmission of the pathogens. And these are the ones that now are happening during the milking phase or during lactation, and not during the dry period. Because during lactation, of course, the bacteria can spread in two particular ways. They can spread from cow to cow, which would be commonly called contagious spread, or they can spread from the environment to the cow, which is obviously, as you know, known as environmental mastitis. Again, this is quite logical, because if we're having contagious spread, then we know that's likely to be happening in the parlour, and that's going to be to do with the parlour routine or the milking machine, and we need to focus attention there. But of course, if it's from the environment, then it means we can and we need to look towards environmental measures to control mastitis. So it means we maybe have the dry period, or we can separate our infection patterns into the dry period or the milking period. It means we can look at either contagious spread or environmental spread, but actually we can be a bit cleverer than that as well, because we can split this down further and actually say, well, are there particular seasons when these patterns are happening? Are there times of year? Are there particular groups of cows which these new infections are happening in. And particularly here, we're going to be thinking of maiden heifers. And we know that heifers calving for the first time are often susceptible to picking up infections in the period just before they calve or in that first lactation. And again, we need to know about that so we can target what to do with our control. So, modern mastitis control, I guess, then looks something a bit like this. We have farm-specific patterns. So what we've tried to do is think about the new infections. Where are the new infections coming from on your farm? Therefore, what are the areas of risk, and how can we make the optimal changes? The question is, and one of the questions then to ask is, well, do you know your patterns? So if we've talked about the dry period and lactation, and we've talked about contagious or environmental, what's going on your farm at the moment? What patterns do you have? Because without knowing this, it's very hard to be specific about identifying the areas of risk and then making changes. And otherwise, we tend to just maybe just make changes in a slightly, if you like, random fashion, or just decide that certain areas might be causing us a problem without really understanding and being sure about where our new infections really are coming from. However, finding out about the patterns can be quite difficult. I know, and I hope a lot of you will work with your vets and maybe know some of this yourselves from using your data. But it can be time consuming to work these patterns out. It often means looking at patterns of cell counts and clinical mastitis over time, trying to look at a variety of graphs to work out which are the important areas, and actually knowing about these patterns, although it's possible, of course, it's just maybe a little bit more difficult, and they're maybe not done as commonly or as regularly, rather, as it might be. And because of that, really the need to know about these patterns and the slight difficulty with it and the time-consuming nature led us to do this first bit of research, really, that I just want to talk about now. So the aim of this research was to try to automate this process of identifying the main patterns of infection on a dairy farm. So if we can actually do this using farm data in an automated way, using records that you have anyway, such as your cell count records and your clinical mastitis records, if we could produce a tool to do that, then that would allow you to have knowledge of those patterns and to be able to act on them very quickly. So the idea of the research was to highlight these new infection patterns, and from that go on to highlight the areas that would be most worth your while looking at in terms of controlling mastitis. So, as a part of this research, then we wanted to develop a tool which we've called the pattern analysis tool, actually to do this for you. So to work out your new infection patterns. And what we did with this was we basically got a lot of data from a lot of herds. So we got some somatic cell count data over several years from just over 100 herds initially. We got the clinical mastitis data from those herds, and we also made sure we broke down the heifer data from those herds. But what was important from the herds that we chose was that they'd already been thoroughly worked up. So we knew precisely what the patterns of these herds were and what the infection patterns have been over time. So it was really clear from the start that we had herds which we knew an awful lot about. And then what we did was to use all the data from those herds to basically try to predict, just using mathematical and numeric methods, what the mastitis patterns were. So basically, it's bundling all of the herd's mastitis data together, all the data that we could get and that's readily available, and actually using that to say, okay, given all that data, can we actually say what the main patterns of infection are within these herds? So as we're developing the tool, what we did was we started with 50 herds, and these 50 herds, as I say, had this known diagnosis. We used some particular types of model to put this together based on some rules, And essentially with those 50 herds, we said, okay, let's try to optimize the model in terms of defining the patterns. So we use these 50 herds, if you like, to train the model, to identify the particular mastitis patterns on herds. And these patterns are the ones that we've talked about before. These would be, are they mainly dry period or lactating period? Are they mainly contagious or environmental? And to what extent seasonality and heifers involved? So once we've optimized those patterns, what we then did was to test those on another 50 herds. So now we let the model decide what the herds were doing, rather than using the data that we already had where we knew what the herd patterns were. And actually we found pretty good agreement with these. About 90% of the time the model would get this right. And it's probably worth saying that even in the other 10% of time when the model wasn't quite right, in fact, they were herds where they had more than one pattern often going on, and the model may have maybe just say opted for dry period instead of lactating period, but in fact the herds often had a substantial element of both. So in fact the model worked very well and the agreement was very good, but the huge benefit is it actually takes the model about 3 seconds to make the diagnosis, instead of probably about maybe half to an hour if we're doing it manually. So the tool that was developed from this is actually now available, and it's a free tool that you can use, and it's available through AHDB, who commissioned the research to create the tool. And I'm just going to spend the next sort of 10 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes, just showing you a bit about the tool, showing you how it works, and then literally you can go away and have a go at using it even tomorrow. So basically this is what happens. The tool will use data from your milk recording organization. So we use data which you can download from their websites. We'll talk about that in a minute. It will convert that data into a specific format that we need, that we can use in our new tool, i.e. the model that I've just talked about. And then, as I say, very, very quickly, in a few seconds, once the data has been prepared, you'll get an output immediately, which will actually partition your herd mastitis patterns in particular ways. So you'll get a snapshot at the moment, and also going back over the last year, as to where your main new infection patterns are, with some then guidance as to what to do about it. So these are the steps that you need to go through to implement the pattern analysis tool, and I'm going to go through these slide by slide and one by one, just so that you can follow them sort of more closely. But basically, there's these sort of 6 steps that you need to go through to do that. So the first thing you need to do is actually to go and find the tool, and these are the websites where they're available. As I say, they're freely available. So the mastitis pattern tool itself is on the AHD website here, and then there's a converter tool that you need, which converts the file from your milk recording organization into some data that the pattern analysis tool can use, as you'll see in a minute, and that's available here and also through the AHDB website on the same page as the pattern tool. So on these pages, you just literally click download, and then you can download these files, and you have the tool sitting on your computer. And once you've done that once, you can repeatedly use the tool with new data at every milk recording or every few months as you wish. So the first step then, having got the files, having got the tools, is to get the data from your milk recording organization. As I say, CIS, NMR, and QMS all produce what's called a CDL file, a common data layer file, and they will all give you access to these from either a website or via email. So these are some examples of the sites here. If you're not sure how to get these, you can contact your milk recorder, but there are also some instructions that we provide for this, and of course I'm sure you can ask your vets, who may already get or have a look at this data as well with you. So you need to get the CDL file, which is involved, which you'll need to download from a specific website. You then have to convert that file. So that file contains all of your milk recording data. It's a variety of information, and we just have to convert that file into something that we can use in the tool. And so here, this is the converter software, which is the other bit of software which you'll download. Again, it's free for you to use. It's very, very simple. You click the first box, which is load CDL, and you point at the CDL file and load it up. It then takes a few minutes, the converter, especially if you're a largish farm. But then once it's converted the file, you then click on output analysis data, and it will output a CSV file, a type of file that we can use for the tool software. Having done that, you can then open the pattern analysis tool, and sorry, the pattern analysis tool looks like this. So this is after you've downloaded it and then opened it, you'll get this front page. You then click on this button here, which is import CSV, and actually then immediately the data comes in the right format from your CDL file and just fills the sheet up here. So suddenly some data will appear in the sheet. Again, you don't need, this isn't data you need to know about, you won't need to use this data, but this is the data that the tool will then use to help you identify the patterns of mastitis that's going on in your herd. The next step is a data quality check. This just really lets you know if you've got any issues with your data. For example, if you haven't got clinical mastitis recordings in there, or if you've got low numbers of calvings, it will just ask you to be a bit careful. But largely, you'll be able to go past that page and you'll be able to get to the main page, which is this one. And this happens almost instantaneously when you've loaded your data. And this is the main sort of diagnostic page of the pattern analysis tool. So here we have the patterns that we talked about earlier. It will split your herd into the extent to which it's a contagious problem. So the bugs are moving from cow to cow, or an environmental problem, which are these two here. And then, as you can see, it will split it into whether you have more of a dry period issue or more of a lactating period issue, the extent to which heifers are important, and also the extent to which mastitis recurrence is important. And then in these boxes, it will actually give you some different readings in a traffic light system, and there's more explanation with the tool itself when you come to use this. But basically, it says currently, what's my main issue? And it will give you a number and a traffic light. And then recently, which is in the last 3 months, what has the main issue been? And also it will show you going back historically. And these relate to, if you like, the severity of the new infections resulting from these different areas. So it instantly gives you a snapshot of where your new infection patterns are. So if we just have a bit of a close-up of that again, so these are the categories that we talked about before. This is the current situation. A higher number means it's more difficult or more of a problem. And red here means it's been a considerable problem. But there's also a bit of text then to explain what happens. It will say what your predominant issue is, and this is an environmental dry period, for example. And there behind this, there's a bit more text to explain what these issues mean. So very, very quickly, just from your milk recording information, especially if you record all your clinical mastitis in there, which is important for this, then it will give you your predominant pattern very, very quickly. So linked to this, once we've got our predominant pattern, then behind this, we have a series of resources which you can then use, which will line up with your particular new infection pattern. So these are some fact sheets to highlight the main areas which may be causing issues, and we suggest that you obviously look at these. These are also free to use, free to share with your vet and discuss with your vet, and really start to have a look at the possible items that might be causing you issues, but very much related to your main infection pattern, which you've got from the tool. So by understanding your new infection patterns, it can allow you to kind of be guided into the right area. So there's a variety of resources kind of behind this. There's, as well as those fact sheets, we have some videos. Some of you may have seen these videos. So these are a couple of videos on selective dry cow therapy, for example, one about how to select cows and one about administering it. Again, these are a part of a whole bundle of resources. Most of these are available now. There's going to be more available between now and April, actually, and they will be put. All of them will be put on the AHDB website, the same pages that we've looked at, and all of them will be free for you to use. And then also linked to this, of course, is the full AHDB mastitis control plan, which I hope that quite a few of you will have heard of. So maybe if your problems are a bit more entrenched, a bit more complex and problematic, then again, you can implement the whole AHDB mastitis control plan, which is somewhat more in depth than just the pattern analysis tool and the linked resources. And this you would do then with a mastitis control plan trained deliverer who would commonly be your vet. So the pattern analysis tool is free to use. I mean, how often to use it is a question that we sometimes get asked. And I guess this is what we suggest really at the moment. So a quarterly use is really sensible. So running your CDL through the converter and then through the pattern analysis tool every quarter, that will help you to see your current patterns, see if they've changed. It will allow you to react to the situation using resources, and hopefully by doing that regularly, optimize your ongoing control of mastitis. And in fact, there's an industry move to get behind this kind of quarterly approach, and it's going to be called Quarter Pro, probably going to be launched in April or May. And this is really based around this quarterly assessment of data, and then using the pattern analysis tool resources to optimize control. So that's something I think you'll hear a bit more about in the coming months, but it's based on the principles that we've just been describing to do with the pattern analysis tool. So I guess back where we started, modern mastitis control, I think now is much more about trying to be farm specific. It's about being farm specific in terms of understanding your own patterns, your own infection patterns, so that you can implement relevant control policies, and very much targeting the resources you got, which of course are always going to be limited, into the right areas. That's really the principle of underlying the pattern analysis tool and understanding patterns of mastitis on farm. One of the things alongside this, though, and I guess this is something to challenge you all, and that we're all challenged with as an industry, is to minimize antibiotic use as we do this. And as we said initially, we can do this by increasing the use of sealants at drying off, so sealants only rather than combination. And we know there's quite a lot of herds with low cell counts now that are sealing over 80% of their cows, some over 90% of their cows. So moving to a position where your control is good enough that you can then have low numbers of infected cows at drying off, and the ability to use sealants on the vast majority of cows is an excellent place to be. And the other thing that we're very conscious of, and it's probably very important now moving forward, is to vastly reduce or maybe almost remove the use of injectable antibiotics for mastitis. I'm just going to say a little bit more about this because it's kind of an interesting issue and something that, again, people often kind of talk about. So one of the things with injectable antibiotics for mastitis control is there has been a bit of work done on this in a whole variety of areas, and the science does really speak to us quite clearly in this. And essentially, what we know with studies that have been done is that if we've just got a normal clinical case, is the addition of injectable antibiotic actually helpful in improving the cure? No, it doesn't seem to be. Are injectables actually useful for chronic or high cell count cows? Again, no, it doesn't look like they are. And what about using injectables at drying off for those high cell count chronic cows to help them through the dry period? Well, again, the science suggests that that's not likely to be beneficial. So in fact, it seems that there are other ways, probably better ways to handle these cows, and the use of injectables for mastitis in these situations is probably not very worthwhile. Possibly an exception for mastitis is the very sick cow, or the toxic mastitis, as we might refer them to, and then it's quite likely that a broad spectrum antibiotic, but not a critically important one, may be useful. And then when we're on the subject of treatments, I guess we should remember that the non-steroidal drugs are something we should probably be thinking of using more instead of the antibiotics for these in terms of injectables. Okay, so that's really the first and the main section that I want to talk about, the importance of understanding new infection patterns in herds, the new tool that you have available to help you to look at your infection patterns very quickly and very routinely, to hopefully help you in terms of looking for where those new infections are occurring. Most of that work has come from research over the last kind of 5 to 8 years, starting with dry period research and then going on into developing the pattern analysis tool. I've just got a few slides at the end to give you a bit of a glimpse of some new research that's happening at the moment, which isn't in any way usable for you right now, but at least might give you a feel for the sort of thing that might come in the future. So one of the things with mastitis pathogens, it turns out, and as work in recent years has shown, is that actually, even within a species, mastitis pathogens seem to vary quite a lot in their behavior. So when I say within a species, I mean Strep uberis as a species or E. coli as a species. So Strep uberis, for example, is not the same at all on all farms, and it's not even the same when you find different strains of Strep uberis within a farm. And in fact, it turns out that you might grow a Strep uberis, culture a Strep uberis if you have a milk sample culture from a cow, but we know that despite the fact they're all the species Strep uberis, some are easy to cure and some are not, for example. They may spread in different ways. Some may behave more environmentally and some more in a contagious pattern. And we also know that some of mastitis pathogens will have different resistance, antimicrobial resistance patterns according to strain. So just knowing the species of a pathogen, a mastitis pathogen, may not be quite enough. And it might be that we can actually refine our control by knowing a bit more about this species level variation. And one way to look at species variation has been to look at the DNA within the bacteria itself. And so the slide I showed you earlier, which was looking at the DNA fingerprinting, as they're called, these DNA bands that we get from, in this case, they were E. coli in cows during the dry period. That's one way of looking at the strain. So you can see all of these together look to be the same strain, and then the next one are different to these, but again the same strain, and so on. But all of these were actually the species E. coli. The problem with this is it's a bit clunky and it takes a while to do, and sequencing, although it's getting cheaper, is probably, we're a long way for things in terms of cow side tests and very fast turnaround. So one technique that is being used actually in quite a lot of labs now around the world is actually using bacterial proteins as opposed to their DNA to identify strains. And this bit of equipment, which is called a moldy TOF, is basically a mass spec machine which actually can give profiles of the proteins which different bacteria are expressing. So over here on the right hand side, you have these peaks and this sort of spectral profile which represents a strain type of a particular, in this case, mastitis pathogen. And by looking at differences between these patterns, it's a bit like looking at differences between the bands in the previous slide. We can start to identify differences between strains within a species of these bacteria. And so here, as I said, instead of doing this banding, the DNA banding kind of approach, we can actually use these spectral profiles. And at the moment, we're just finding that you can differentiate these in this same way. So already there's some early results in this kind of field. So for example, this paper is describing how if you find a bacteria with a certain pattern here, in this case a strep ubris, on a cow in a farm, actually you can predict that there's going to be an outbreak of mastitis, or at least the chances of mastitis happening in the next 2 weeks is suddenly increased. And so knowledge of these strains, again, can maybe, you could see here, we may be able to develop these into early warning systems of times when we may be at increased risk, which again can help us to make changes. And similarly, this was another piece of work, again, differentiating strep ubris, and this time in terms of whether it's a more cow-to-cow, a contagious form of strep ubris, or an environmental form. And again, quite successfully being able to do that within the farm using these, again, these spectral profiles, which can, again, lead us to make decisions around, okay, this is a strep ubris, but this is one where we actually have to look more towards parlour control as opposed to environmental control, which might have been the conventional route we took. So I guess these mass spec profiles are really about refining our decisions, and I think this is the way things will go to some extent. I think the basic patterns we can identify on farms. I think we have the basic processes for control, but actually with these better diagnostics and early warning systems, I think we'll be able to refine these decisions more over time, and hopefully in the next 5 years be better at predicting some of these events. So just to summarize what we've gone through then in the last half an hour or so, I think modern mastitis control, clearly it's still crucial for many reasons. I think what I've tried to, what I hope I've just persuaded you about is that what's really important is to know the patterns on your farms. These farm-specific patterns are the absolute basis for preventing mastitis. Understanding those patterns of infection are what gives you the kind of the power to go and look in the right place. So the new pattern analysis tool is essentially a quick route into that. It's a way of just using your data very quickly to give you the best patterns and therefore allow you to do it more regularly. And hopefully, by using this approach and reducing new infections, we know we will reduce antimicrobial use, which is an industry, that's something that we're being asked to do. So I would like to just thank quite a few people, these guys here who have been very involved with lots of this research, and also the funders here. I've mentioned AHDB, but some of this was also Innovate and BBSRC funded. And I think that's me, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
That's great, Martin. Thank you very much. So yeah, we've got some time for questions now. Just as a reminder for everybody that it has been recorded this evening, the webinar. So if there's anything that you want to go back on, we'll send out the link to watch it again. We've also, as Martin pointed out, we have got all of the resources that are available on the AHDB website, and we'll be able to send out a link for those, including a link for the mastitis pattern tool and the cost calculator. And then the upcoming resources that are still being developed will be able to keep you up to date with these using the Tesco supplier network. So we've just had the one question come in at the moment, so we'll go to that first, Martin. So the question was in relation to sealants. So are they necessary? Can you dry cows off without them, just because sometimes they can migrate around the udder?
Okay, yeah. Are they necessary? Well, I think there's been a lot of research on sealants, and the answer is that compared to nothing, they will reduce new infections in the dry period considerably by something like between 30 and 50% in most herds. So I would say the answer is yes, they're necessary to the extent that actually they will help you control infections in the dry period. If your dry period management is absolutely perfect, then your risk may be low. but actually in the reality of life, teak sealants help dramatically with reducing infections in the dry period. So yeah, I would say still use them.
Okay. So just had another comment in just from Jennifer, just mentioning about injectable antibiotics aren't. I'm not sure if she's finished a question actually. Don't know if you can see on there as well.
Oh yes, I can, but no, if they aren't beneficial.
Okay.
But I haven't got the other the next bit.
Okay.
Oh, maybe it's if they aren't beneficial, what do you do?
Yep.
I don't know. It could be. Should
Okay.
we?
That's all right.
Yeah, so I was going to duck that a bit because I think that's something to speak with individual vets for, and it depends which cows we're talking about. But largely speaking, it's kind of been quite well shown in mastitis trials now that actually lengthening treatment with lactating cow tubes is likely to give more benefit than using injectable antibiotics, for example. But by far the best time to cure cows, of course, will be the dry period. So that's the time we will need to use antibiotics, is infected cows or cows that have been problem cows at drying off. And if we guess that that was the question, then they would be the two main options that you would have rather than injectables. But of course, definitely speak to your own vets about your treatment choices.
That's great. That was the question, so thank you. Okay, right, that's brilliant. So we've not had any other questions come in now, but if there is anything that comes up after this evening, then don't hesitate to get in touch, and we'll be able to answer anything that comes through. So just wanted to say a big thank you for everybody for listening. Really appreciate it, and you can look out forthcoming AHDB webinars, general ones that we're doing, which will be advertised on our events pages. And Martin, thank you very much for taking the time out to do this webinar for us. I really appreciate it, and been a good presentation, so thank you.
Pleasure.
Okie doke. So we'll send out all the information that's needed via Tesco, and that will be sent out in due course. So just want to say thanks again, and good night, everyone.